in general, I'm a really big fan of the Bowers and Wilkins PX7 headphones, and I also like the PX5 on-ear headphones. So when Bowers and Wilkins announced their new soundbar, the Panorama 3, which kind of implies that there are other Panoramas in the pipeline, I was rather excited. Now, overall, I like the general design and material choice of the soundbar, but the Panorama 3 is a very tough sell. Now, I'm gonna be straight up, one of the main reasons why I'm interested in reviewing this soundbar is because a lot of consumer reviews are bashing the Panorama 3. Now, the Panorama 3 isn't that bad, but at a retail price of $1,000, the Panorama 3 is pretty hard to justify. Plus, you can't build out this soundbar with an external subwoofer or surround sound speakers. And I think it's very funny that Bowers and Wilkins proudly stated that you're not going to need an external subwoofer with the soundbar. But in reality, you kind of need an external subwoofer with the soundbar. Now, design-wise, I like the hexagonal and angled shape of this soundbar. I like the fabric wrap front, and I like the perforated brush metal top of this soundbar. And I also really like that the brush metal top of this soundbar doesn't create a reflection, like let's say the glass top on the Bose Smart Soundbar 900, which can be rather distracting depending on your setup. However, my main issue with the soundbar is just its sheer size. This thing is huge. It is up there with the Sony HTA5000, which was an absolute unit as well. The Panorama 3 has a length of 46.6 inches and a depth of 5.5 inches, a little above average. However, the Panorama 3 is still low profile, coming in at a height of 2.5 inches. But what really got me off guard with this soundbar was just its sheer weight. It weighs in at 14.3 pounds. So if you plan on wall mounting the Panorama 3, then you're gonna need a pretty sturdy wall. But thankfully, the Panorama 3 does come included with a heavy-duty wall mounting bracket. And in general, I like to see that this wall mounting bracket comes included with the Panorama 3, because with other soundbars, like let's say Bose or Sonos, their wall mounting kits are sold separately, or the included wall mounting kits that you'll get with Sony and Samsung are pretty cheap. Now, speaking about what comes in the box, you also get an AC power cable, and this cable is your standard AC power cable. It's decently long and it's decently flexible. Thankfully, there isn't an external power brick that you have to worry about hiding, but just given this soundbar's sheer size, there better not be an external power brick. And finally, the soundbar also comes included with an HDMI cable, and that's pretty much it. Unfortunately, the Panorama 3 does not come included with an included remote, like either Bose's or Sony's soundbars. Now, personally, I am rather indifferent because I never really use the remote controls that come included with my soundbars. I just end up using their apps. However, the Panorama 3 does have onboard media control buttons on them that present themselves when your hand gets near the touch-sensitive surface. But unlike Sonos' soundbars, which also have touch-sensitive buttons on them, you can't deactivate the touch-sensitive buttons on the Panorama 3. And this could be a problem if you've got little kids running around the house. So hopefully, maybe in the near future, Bowers & Wilkins will put out a new feature which will allow you to deactivate the touch-sensitive buttons on the Panorama 3. But now let's talk about the port on this soundbar, because unfortunately it is pretty basic for a $1,000 soundbar. Now, the Panorama 3 has a single HDMI out port that has eARC support, but that's pretty much a given that this is a Dolby Atmos soundbar. Unfortunately, the Panorama 3 does not have an HDMI input, so you can't directly plug in a Blu-ray player into this soundbar. So the Panorama 3 is going to be mostly targeted at people who are just going to be strictly streaming their content. Now, the Panorama 3 also has an optical port just in case your TV doesn't have an HDMI in port that has ARC or eARC support. But personally, I feel that if your TV does not have ARC or eARC support, then you should probably upgrade your TV before getting a soundbar like this. And the Panorama 3 also has an Ethernet port, just in case you're having Wi-Fi trouble at home. But I also feel that if you're having Wi-Fi trouble at home, then you should probably upgrade your access point before getting a soundbar like this. Since the Panorama 3 is mostly targeted at people who's going to be streaming their content, if you were to upgrade your access point, then your content is less likely to buffer. So overall, I do expect that the optical port and Ethernet port on the Panorama 3 is going to go mostly unused. And besides, this soundbar does have Wi-Fi, and it also has AirPlay 2 support. So if you're an iPhone user, as long as you're connected to the same Wi-Fi network as this soundbar, then you're going to be able to stream music to it. And if you want to, you can always just use this soundbar as a smart speaker. However, the Panorama 3 only has support for Alexa, but maybe in the future they will add Google Assistant support as well. But let's say you don't want to connect the soundbar up to Wi-Fi due to security reasons. You can always still stream music to it using Bluetooth, and the Panorama 3 is one of the few soundbars out there that have aptX adaptive support. But overall, I do recommend that you connect the soundbar up to Wi-Fi so that you can at least take advantage of AirPlay. But now let's talk about speaker setups, because the Panorama 3 has a lot going on under the hood. The Panorama 3 has 3 frontward firing tweeters, and it has a total of 8 drivers, 6 of which fire out the front. And there are 2 upwards firing drivers, which are supposed to bounce sound off of the ceiling, and they are what give this soundbar true Dolby Atmos support. And the Panorama 3 also has 2 upwards firing subwoofers, which are supposed to handle the bass. Now, in general, I've found that soundbars that have upward firing subwoofers tend to have more bass than soundbars with bass chambers like Bose's soundbars. And in general, a very popular example of a soundbar with an above average amounts of bass is the JBL Bar 5.0, which also has similar upward firing subwoofers like the Panorama 3. But unfortunately, the Panorama 3 doesn't have all that much physicality in its bass. So with the Panorama 3, you're not really going to feel what's happening on the screen. And this is a very important job for a soundbar. And in general, I would argue that the Bose Smart Soundbar 300 has more bass than the Panorama 3, and it also sounds better as well. Now, the Panorama 3 is able to get significantly louder than the Bose Smart Soundbar 300 at max volume, but overall, I do feel the 300 sounds better than the Panorama 3, all while costing half as much and having way less hardware.
Could've seen it in your eyes. Look a second better right here, waiting for you with open arms. How about you coming closer? We can do my place. Maybe we can try meeting up by 7. You'll be saying over, so it's guaranteed. I'll be forever thinking about you and me. I don't wanna let you go. I don't wanna let you go. Tell me what you want to know. Run your fingers down me slow. 'Cause you're in my head. You are. 'Cause you're in my head. 'Cause you're in my What you think? What you think? 'Cause you're in my What you think? What you think? 'Cause you're in my You love that I've been crying. With me, I'm not gonna be sad. We can be us in a story where dreams and reality collide. Are we back to the start? I can play the game, but I'm falling again. No, don't hold back, take it far. Promise you the same, let the pleasure begin. How about you coming closer? We can do my place. Maybe we can right. Meeting at the 7, you'll be staying over, so it's guaranteed. I'll be forever thinking about you and me. I don't wanna let you go. I don't wanna let you go. Nah. Tell me what you want to know. Run your fingers down me slow. 'Cause you're in my head. You are. 'Cause you're in my head. 'Cause you're in my. I don't wanna let you go. I don't wanna let you go. Tell me what you want to know. Run your fingers down me slow. 'Cause you're in my head. You are. 'Cause you're in my head.
Enemy shield. Reloading.
Adding another gas trap. Processing and waiting. I found the hostile.
So, like you may have just heard, obviously any soundbar is going to sound better than your TV's built-in speakers. Your TV most likely just has a pair of downward firing speakers that bounce sound off of the table. They don't get all that loud, and when the bass really gets going, it just becomes a rattling mess. In most cases, getting a soundbar is going to be a good investment. However, I would actually argue that if you have a more premium TV, like let's say the Samsung Q80A or something above that, or an equivalent to Sony or LG, I would argue that the Bowers and Wilkins Panorama 3 isn't going to sound all that much better. And I would assume that with the soundbar's $1,000 price tag and the type of people that Bowers and Wilkins tends to market to, it's safe to assume that this customer base would have a more premium TV. Because in this sound test was conducted with a more mid-tier $500 TV whose built-in speakers aren't as good as the built-in speakers that you'll find in a more premium TV. Now, my main problem with the Panorama 3 is that it does have a rather shallow sound signature, so more nuanced sounds get lost very easily. And I hope that in this sound test, you were able to notice that you were able to hear the Watson generator and footsteps much easier with the Bose 300 than you could with the Panorama 3. But the very strange thing about the Panorama 3 is that even though it does have a very shallow sound signature, it doesn't have all that much bass. And for comparison's sake, the Sony HCA 5000 also has a rather shallow sound signature to it, but it has a lot of physicality to its bass, which could be a fair trade-off if this is what you're looking for in your soundbar. Now, you can go in and raise the bass on the Panorama 3, but if you do this, you're not really going to get any more physicality out of its bass. It's just going to sound more shallow. So right now, I'm basically at the point where I really hope Bowers and Wilkins puts out a new firmware update for the Panorama 3 that will put its upward firing subwoofers to better use. Because given this soundbar's just speaker setup, the Panorama 3 should be kicking out a lot more bass. And I'm just saying, during this sound test, both of these soundbars were playing with their stock EQs. But if you want to, you can always go and raise the bass on the Bose Smart Soundbar 300 and get more physicality out of its bass. However, if you were to go and raise the bass on the 300, the soundbar isn't going to start sounding super shallow like the Panorama 3. With the 300, you're still going to be able to hear those more nuanced sounds. And finally, there's the Dolby Atmos effect of this soundbar. Given that the Panorama 3 does sound rather shallow and instrument separation isn't the best on this soundbar, the soundbar doesn't do the best job of immersing you in your content. And given that the verticality effect of this soundbar is pretty weak, the Panorama 3 sounds like your standard soundbar. And unfortunately, unlike a lot of other Dolby Atmos soundbars, you can't adjust the verticality effect on the Panorama Panorama 3. So, with all that being said, the Bowers and Wilkins Panorama 3 is a visually appealing soundbar. It is very stylish. I love how this soundbar looks, and I love the material choices here. However, performance-wise, the Panorama 3 struggles to keep up with soundbars half its size and half its price. Sure, the Panorama 3 can get super loud, but it does sound rather shallow and rather narrow, and the soundbar has very little physicality to its bass. And personally, I feel that physicality in its bass is very important for a soundbar because you want to be able to feel what's happening on the screen. So overall, the Panorama 3 is oversized and under-delivers. You can't build it out with an external subwoofer or surround sound speakers. And then there's the streaming-only focus port setup of the Panorama 3. A $1,000 soundbar like this should have at least one HDMI input. Hopefully, Bowers and Wilkins will put out a firmware update that will overhaul the performance of the Panorama 3. Because speaker setup-wise, there's a lot going on under the hood, and this thing should be kicking out a lot more bass. But for right now, this is a hard pass for me. If you made it this far, I guess you enjoyed the video, so hit the like button and get subscribed. If you want to pick any of the products up, they'll be linked down below. And if you want to further support the channel, check out the merch. I made some shirts and hoodies that look and feel great. And you know I can be very particular, so I'll only slap my name on something if I'm really proud of it.